Women's FA Cup final is only a few days away. So let's talk about it. This year's Women's FA Cup will be won by a team that has never lifted this trophy before, as the stage is set at a sold-out Wembley between second-time finalists Manchester United and first-time finalists Spurs. This is United's second time in this final consecutively. They appeared as first-time finalists last year, lost a very narrow final 1-0 to Chelsea. Across of them stands a revolutionized Spurs team after Robert Villenham took over the side at the start of the season. They were obviously, as some of you recall, were in somewhat of a relegation battle at some point of the season last year. Obviously, managerial changes happened. The fact that it's already been announced that this will be a sold-out Wembley for two finalists who have never won this trophy before, Spurs have never even been in this position before, just shows you how much the game has grown in England. But more than anything, I'm very excited to see a final that's very evenly and closely matched, where you don't have a big giant favorite who you know is going to win. There's a little bit of a mysterious, we actually don't know who is going to walk away the winner here. Looking at their routes to the final, no finalist gets there with a fluke and no finalists win the final in a fluke. And both United and Spurs have had completely different routes and completely different, journeys to how they got to the final. Starting off with United, their FA Cup form has been immaculate. I mean, they've won every single game. They beat Newcastle 5-0. They beat Brighton 4-0. They beat Chelsea in the semi-final 2-1 to get to this position. Not only was that a huge win to book themselves into a final, but that was also their first ever win against Chelsea. So definitely there was a lot on the plate there. And really, once you get past Chelsea, you go into that final with so much confidence. That Chelsea game was, I think, honestly, not even arguably, but undoubtedly their best performance this season so far. And it's particularly interesting to see how well they've done in the FA Cup, how seamlessly they've been able to pass through their opponents and again, get across the hurdle of Chelsea, but still struggle in the WSL. And I think it's almost like the team, after 7 or 8 match days in the league, it was like, right, we're not going to have the similar run that we had last season, whether that be it because of personnel that's available. Obviously, Gabby George with an ACL very early on was not a great start. They had a few summer signings come in, which we can talk about later, but certainly have not had the impact that Mark Skinner or any of the team was hoping they'd have an impact. And there's been just too many factors for them that have not gone their way in the league. And so it almost looked like when United would show up to an FA Cup game, it was like, one, we need to get revenge against Chelsea, and we're probably going to meet them down the line, either that be in the semi-final or in the final. Now we know that was in the semi-final. Realistically, by the time they got to the game against Brighton, it was like, this is possibly the only cup they can get. And so it almost was that the FA Cup was seriously and truly their only cup that they can win this year, which is why we've seen this such solid, cohesive run in the FA Cup. Cohesiveness is one thing that we got to see every single game from them in the FA Cup that we've really not properly seen in the WSL, is that cohesiveness, that working together as a team, as a unit, that's been lacking a little bit when we see them in the league. They've not had any trouble scoring goals. Nikita Paris specifically has really been showing up for these FA Cup games, 11 goals for the team, 1 conceded. It's been a pretty good run for a United fan, and they go into Wembley. This is not the first time they've been at Wembley. A lot of these players also internationally have been in this big spot before, but this is not their first time going to Wembley. Playing at Wembley in a final is just a different kind of animal. Tottenham, on the other hand, have not had this very easy run into the FA Cup final. Their first game was a 3-2 victory over Sheffield United, which doesn't sound so bad, but it's actually Spurs having to work back from a 2-0 deficit. That's right. They were 2-0 down at one point. Winning 3-2 came with an extra time winner. It was a Beth England brace. She had a penalty in the 80th minute. It was quite a dramatic start to their FA Cup journey, but certainly this was the first test, and having to work from behind and having to try and not push the game over to extra time, because with how the FA Cup rules work. So a 3-2 comeback victory was certainly, I don't know if it was on their bingo card to start the cup that way, but that's how they did it. They then went on to beat Charlton 1-0, and then the big bang came in the quarterfinals with them defeating Manchester City in penalties. Now, if you recall, these two did play each other maybe one too many times. Even at the start of the season, City defeated Tottenham 7-0. It was a very lopsided win that it was like, is Tottenham going to be really back in the relegation battle? Are we believing in this Villarreal project, but they didn't have the easiest first meeting to City, and which makes their quarterfinal victory just that much more impressive in the fact they drew them in natural time. Granted, I think City was below par this game, which doesn't really matter. If you're looking from a Spurs perspective, you drew them in natural time, you took them to penalties, you beat them on penalties, and you just like that kicked them out of the FA Cup. The semi-final was against Leicester City. Again, they were 1-0 down. They had to work back from a 1-0 deficit, took it to extra time to then win 2-1 and then go to the final. So just by the time the Spurs got to this FA Cup final, they've been to penalties against City. They've been to extra time against Leicester City. They've also had to work from deficits twice in that first opening game and then also against Leicester City. And so Spurs have been tested in pretty much every single game leading up to this final. And again, that win that they had over Charlton 1-0 isn't necessarily the most comfortable lead that you'd be sitting at. And so they too didn't have the best game there, and they didn't have the best game management even looking back at it, because they could have killed the game probably 4 or 5 times that I can just think on top of my head. And I think in some ways a final is always going to present you those tough questions and those tough exams is how are you going to react when you're 2-0 behind? What is your game management plan when you're actually leading 1-0 and it's the 90th minute and United bring on Rachel Williams? How are you going to manage that? And in some ways, Tottenham have been able to get tested. It's almost like they've gone through all the mock exams. They've gone through all the little mini weekly tests. And now they're getting to the final exam at Wembley, which, like I mentioned, this is their first time there now. Obviously, a lot of the players in the squad have been at Wembley before. They have been in these big situations. Martha Thomas was at Wembley's FA Cup final last year with United. Beth England, I mean, do I need to sit here and tell you how experienced Beth England is? And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how Spurs show up for this very, very big game. It's a huge achievement for the club, and so it's going to be really interesting to see how both teams react in tough situations. If United go behind, are they going to give us that attitude of I don't want to be there like they have this entire WSL season? If Spurs do that, do they take it to penalties? How are they going to manage these tough calls in a very, very big final like this is something that I'm very, very intrigued to see. Now, it just happens to be that those teams actually faced each other 3 games ago in the WSL, so at the end of April almost, which is really not that long ago. That was a 2-2 draw. Their first meeting, obviously, in the league was a 4-0 win to United. And I think, in some ways, I don't like seeing teams that are in the final face each other this kind of soon before a final, because obviously the managers and the staff is going to be analyzing the hell out of the opposition. And even with this game that was kind of underwhelming from both sides, and you could see a lot of the tactics were kind of being held back, and it's like, we started with one plan and let's just stick to it. Let's not experiment too much. Even with that very limited showing, managers are going to be rolling back that footage and analyzing every single movement from every single player. Leaving it on a draw really sets you up of this is just as close as you first thought, and this will be really, really tight in the final. At the end of the day, this is the 5th and the 6th team of the WSL. So it's not like you're talking about Chelsea versus Spurs with, 5 teams in between them. No, this is really tight when it comes to rankings, but also how we've seen them perform. Following this draw, United went on to win against Leicester City. It was a pretty boring, again, uninspiring performance in some ways. That was then followed by Liverpool's special, United losing 1-0 to Liverpool. For Spurs, on the other hand, after that draw with United, they go on to draw 2 more against Brighton and against Everton. Again, a bit of a dip in form for both teams, possibly because they want to focus all their time and energy into the FA Cup final. Possibly we're trying different kind of tactics, different kind of chemistry links that they wanted to develop with these games, preparing for the FA Cup. And it's right, if we're sitting in 5th and 6th right now, there's not so much to fight for in the league. Let's keep our players fit, let's manage injuries, let's manage minutes, and really let's just get as ready as possible to that FA Cup final. Which, speaking of players who have to, which speaking of players, every player needs to step up and show up in a final. I think there's been a few players on the United side that have underperformed. I want to highlight Ella Toon, who I think is an exceptional player, but is just so inconsistent with her performances. Either she's having an absolute, one of the best games of the season, or it's like is she even on the pitch? And granted, a lot of the Mark Skinner setups this season, specifically in the midfield, have not set her up for success. Like, Ella Toon needs to step up on this occasion, and Wembley is a place that she knows how to do good on, specifically with England, and so I hope she feels at home for this one and is able to create and do what she does best for United. Another player who I think is going to answer a lot of the questions for United is how fit is Jade Riviere. She's just coming back from injury. She returned on the pitch against Liverpool, didn't start obviously because she's managing minutes. She's come back from like a pretty big thigh injury that kept her out for over a month. She missed the last international window. Is it going to be Ifemanian? Is it going to be Evans on those flanks? Because, I mean, good lord, if it's Evans and you've got just Naz running at you, I fear that Spurs are going to be having a field day on those flanks. Again, depending where they're deployed. It'll probably be Naz against Letitia, but it's not going to be fun if you're having Evans or Ifemanian even on those flanks, because Tottenham have threatened on those areas. They've been very dangerous, and Jade Riviere is a player that I know most definitely will want to be involved in this. It's a matter of how many minutes she can get, and it's a matter of, does she start and then she's taken off at halftime? Does she come in the 60th minute and try to stabilize the last 30 minutes? Granted, you have to take in consideration that this game could go into extra time. Is this a player that you're risking to put into extra time? There's going to be a lot of questions to answer, and I think Jade Riviere and how fit she is and how many minutes she's able to get is going to be absolutely crucial to how United are able to stay kind of solid and not leaky in the back, which they have not been leaky in the back when it came to the FA Cup. For Spurs, I just mentioned Just Naz. I mean, we don't speak enough about how important she has been, and she's kind of been a player who has had to be very patient for her opportunities and very patient in developing and building. And it does look like Robert Wilhelm is coming in and really maximized what those youngsters can do. Wilhelm joined me here on the podcast to talk a little bit about his journey and his coaching philosophies back in January. So if you're interested in finding a little bit more about how he has made it into the women's game when he started as a player in the men's game, obviously, how he's been able to re-energize this Tottenham team and what's his philosophy working with youngsters. He also talks about his football academy in Uganda. So if you're interested in listening to that episode, then I most definitely recommend you do. So I'll leave a link down below. But back to the youngsters in the Spurs team, they've really been able to shine, and I love that. And I think Grace Clinton, who unfortunately will be missing the final because she's on loan from United, can't play against her parent club unless her parent club allows her, and there's no way United are going to allow Grace Clinton to play against them in the final. So a big blow for both the team and the player, but she has been so instrumental to all their success and all their improvements this season. Not only have they gone themselves into final, but they also won their first North London derby this season. They also drew with Arsenal in the cup and now they're in their first ever FA Cup final. And so Wilhelm has done a really, really great job in pushing Tottenham to their first ever X, Y, and Z, to their first ever achievement. The January signings that they've made are really, really neat. I think if they get the signings that they're after this summer, it's going to be a very dangerous Tottenham squad that Wilhelm is building. But Tottenham in some ways have continued to build one game after the other, and yes, they are on a bit of a dip in form, but you are getting to see that development in their play. Previously under Ryan Skinner, and I mean, like, last season was a big highlight of that. You'd watch a lot of the Spurs games and you're like, what are they trying to build here? What's their style of football? And unfortunately, a lot of times you would just scratch your head and just not know what kind of style of football you're watching. Whereas this season, there's a clear emphasis on wanting to build from the back, wanting to press when the opportunity presents itself, being really dangerous on the flanks, but most importantly, building from the back, getting every single player involved in the build-up. Every single player has a position to be in that exploits their opposition. It has been really, really impressive to see a team build this quickly. Are they going to build from the back against United? I mean, that definitely had them in trouble in that first meeting between the two. So maybe they take lessons from that. I'm not really sure, because they will have to be very cautious and wary against the United side, who has been on form when it came to the FA Cup. It almost feels like this game will be decided by who is most clinical in front of goal, which is something that United have not been this season, but they most definitely have been in the FA Cup. To be able to score 2 against Chelsea and hold on to that lead, it took 2 words: being clinical. And United were actually being clinical. And that's what United need to be if they want to walk away with a win. Get a lead or two and just hold on to that. Make sure they're clinical in front of goal, because both of those teams are going to look to put defensive master classes, and perhaps I'd assume not many will get 10 or 20 shots each. And so it's a matter of making the most when you're in front of goal. Make it a little bit of a dirty, clumsy play, like fall in the box, get a penalty, like fall in the box legally, and like make it chaotic where the opposition puts a wrong foot leg in front of you. What I do know is this is going to be a fantastic match for a neutral. I'm super excited to see a new winner. We're guaranteed to see history here. We're finally seeing 2 brand new finalists, 5th and 6th in the WSL. Just again tells you how the game is developed, the competitiveness. I think this is fantastic for the game in England in general. I think when you kept having those City Chelsea finals, it's like, okay, right, what about the few teams below? Are we going to see those win an FA Cup? Which is what we're seeing this year, so it's going to be exciting. It's going to be a sold out Wembley. Predictions, I'm not a big one for predictions. I think it's a matter of who's able to have their clinical finishes, like I mentioned, not crumble under the pressure. I think United have crumbled under the pressure a few times, and if there was a game that I thought they had to show up, was their Manchester derby at Old Trafford, which you look back at that, it was probably a game to forget for a lot of United fans. It was disorganized, it was sloppy, it was disconnected. It was like the players did not want to be there. As a neutral, always rooting for the underdog, I took a look at the odds. It looked like Spurs are coming in as the underdogs, and so I guess I'll have to be rooting for the underdogs here. Regardless, we're granted to see some history, a new winner, and I'm very, very excited about that. Let me know your thoughts on this. Who do you think will grab this? Will you be at Wembley? I certainly wish I was at Wembley for such a final like this, but not this year, maybe another. I'll also be doing a recap of the game when we do have our winner and we do have everything play out. Hopefully, I do not want to have a discourse about the officiating, so I'm praying and manifesting that all the officiating and refereeing decisions are on point. So to be able to watch that recap and the many, many exciting videos that I do have planned for you, some very great interviews that are going to come out on this podcast and channel very, very soon as well. Make sure to subscribe to me here on YouTube and hit that bell button. And as always, to stay updated and to continue enjoying the beautiful game, make sure to subscribe to me here on YouTube and follow me on Twitter. And I will see you later.